Roger, I think you can go. I think you can start.
Good evening. I'm Roger Blood, Chair of the Brookline Housing Advisory Board.
Добрый вечер, я Роджер Блэд, я из
Next slide, please.
жилищного комитета.
On behalf of the Housing Advisory Board and the Planning Department staff and the Housing Production Working Group,
Вот все эти имена, которые
I'm delighted to see so many of you attending this evening and so much interest in housing and Brookline's affordable housing needs and plans. I mentioned the Housing Production Plan Working Group, and you can see the names of those folks on the slide before you. This is a group of Housing Advisory Planning Board and Advisory Committee members with several staff people, including the Planning Director, that are serving to guide the work of our consulting team on this important project. This evening is the first of several community-wide outreach forums that are part of our consulting team's work in updating Brookline's 2016 housing production plan. The main reason that we undertook our first housing production plan was the Commonwealth's rules for setting housing goals under so-called Chapter 40B. Brookline needed to produce an annual plan acceptable to the state for us to reach the state's affordable housing goal of 10%. In 2016, we were only at 8.6%, 367 affordable units short of the 10% goal. Now in January of 2022, we're on the verge of passing that 10% threshold that will now allow Brookline to chart its own housing production pathway going forward. Most cities and towns don't do housing production plans and update them once they've achieved the state's 10% goal and are freed of the state-imposed Chapter 40B rules. Unlike 2016, our main reason for doing this updated housing production plan is no longer to fulfill state rules. This post 10% production plan, with your help, is to create a community-driven, thoughtful and achievable plan for much needed affordable housing. We're fortunate to have a terrific consulting team leading this effort, terrific in several important respects. First, our team leader, Judy Barrett, who led Brookline's prior housing production plan effort, brings to this project both continuity and a deep understanding of Brookline, along with a mastery of affordable housing in all of its challenging dimensions. In effect, we're hitting the ground running. Judy's current housing production team, however, is entirely different from last time. Responding to our 2021 request for proposals work program, the current team also includes capable and experienced professionals in both the areas of community engagement and location-based planning. At this point, I'm delighted to introduce Judy Barrett, who will share with you more about her team, her work program for the town, her plans, and what to expect from this evening's effort. We hope that you find both this evening and upcoming housing production plan community events to be worthwhile and meaningful for you. And with that, Judy, the floor is all yours.
Roger, thank you so much. So Catherine, can we go to the next slide? So we are a team. I'm Judy Barrett. I'm delighted and thrilled and honored to be here and very happy to see so many people having signed up for this meeting. On the team, we have Daphne Politis, who you'll hear a bit from momentarily. Daphne is our community engagement lead. We also have consultants from Dodson and Flinker, landscape architects, with a firm that we do a lot of work with and always enjoy working with them. In addition, we have interpreters and translators from Language Connections, and they will be available for support for this meeting throughout. We have 4 languages represented. Daphne will address that in a moment. I also want to tell you that because so many people registered for this meeting, we called on some of our colleagues in other consulting firms who are not actually on this team, but who graciously agreed to help us out for facilitation when we get to the breakout sessions for this meeting. And so I won't introduce everybody now, but we do have consultants from Horsley Witten Group and from Beta Group who've agreed to help us out. And I'm very grateful for their assistance. And we also have a number of town staff and others, all of whom you will get to meet eventually as we go on. So slide, please, Catherine. Daphne.
Thanks, Judy. So as Judy mentioned, Brookline is home to many people who speak many languages at home. And so in order to create a community conversation that's all inclusive, we are providing interpretation services, simultaneous interpretation in Mandarin, Spanish, Cantonese, and Russian. There are interpreters here who will explain to you how to access if you haven't done so before on Zoom. So Terry, could you please explain in Mandarin how to access Zoom's interpretation mechanism? Catherine, you have to undo the interpretation so that Terry can speak to the large group.
All right, guys, technical difficulties. It says interpretation is off.
Oh, because I see it as on.
There we go.
Did it, Catherine?
Great. Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Terry. I will be the Mandarin interpreter for the meeting tonight. 大家好，我是 Terry， 我会是你们的国语翻译。待会呢，你在屏幕下方会看到一个地球仪的图标，点一下地球仪的图标，然后再选择 Mandarin， 你就可以进入到国语的频道了。我们今天还有好几个其他的语言。如果你是用手机或者是平板电脑上网的话呢，你可以选择屏幕下方的3个点。 然后再选择 Language Interpretation， 就是语言翻译，然后你也可以进入到国语的频道。好，谢谢大家。Thank you, Emily. Go ahead.
Buenas noches y bienvenidos a todos a la reunión de esta noche. Mi nombre es Emily, estoy aquí para proporcionar interpretación en español. En un momentico vamos a encender la función de interpretación y verán entonces al fondo de su ventana de Zoom un globito, un iconito de un globito. Simplemente haz clic en el globo, de ahí escoge Spanish. Y ya está listo para escuchar. Si se está conectando tras un móvil, empuje los 3 puntitos y de ahí escoge Interpretation, pues Spanish, pues Done, para escuchar la presentación en español. Si tiene cualquier problema, nos deja saber tras el chat. Muchas gracias. Now I hand it over to Cantonese.
大家好，我叫 Julie 咧。 我喺呢度，我今晚做你哋嘅廣東話翻譯。如果你需要廣東話翻譯嘅時候咧，你睇嗰個圖標下面有個地球嘅形狀，你撳嗰個地球嘅形狀，你就會睇到不同嘅語言。你可以選廣東話，就係 Cantonese。咁你撳嗰個掣咧，佢就會帶你到廣東話嗰個頻道。咁咧歡迎大家嚟參與今晚嘅活動。So, I will give time to our Russian interpreter.
Yes, hi. My name is Nona. I'm the interpreter for Russian language. Здравствуйте, меня зовут Нона, я переводчик русского языка. Я буду вам помогать, если есть такая у вас нужда, понимать, что происходит во время совещания. Если вам нужен переводчик, то есть одновременно вместе с совещанием, вам нужно там кликнуть на вот правая сторона в углу, там слово interpretation, выбрать русский язык, Russian, и вы будете слышать мой голос с переводом. Всего хорошего. Thank you.
Going to re-enable interpretation. There we go. So you should get a notification now.
Thank you for all the interpreters. Thank you to all of them.
Catherine, when you're ready, here we go. So yes, thank you to the interpreters. Thank you, Daphne. And thank you everyone who registered and is participating in this meeting. So I want to just go over a few kind of ground rules very briefly. We would appreciate it if you stay on mute unless one of the facilitators asks you to unmute. We just have a lot of people on the meeting. We want to accommodate everybody. When we get to breakout rooms, you'll have an opportunity to consider a series of questions. We'll go over the instructions for that a bit later. A lot of that may take place in chat depending on the size of the group, but people will be given an opportunity to speak as well. If you have questions during the presentation, we would ask you to put them in the chat box. We're going to try to move through a lot of material tonight. There probably won't be time to do any kind of responding to questions in the meeting. We're going to save the chat. We're going to respond to everybody's questions, and our responses will be posted on the town's housing production plan website, the link for which, of course, is here. If you're watching this not on Zoom, but at home, we have a form on the town website with the same discussion group questions that will be asked in the breakout session, and you'll have an opportunity to respond to those questions as well if you're not in the meeting with us. The form is again on the Housing Production Plan website. You can find it there, and all the questions will be available for you to respond to. We'll only leave that form up probably through tomorrow morning, because it really is intended for people who are otherwise kind of participating, even if, you know, from afar in this meeting this evening. Next slide, please. So the presentation is really kind of making sure everybody understands what a housing production plan is. A little bit of a look back to 2016 to kind of see, well, what has happened since the last plan was done. We'll give you a little bit of an overview about the housing needs assessment that we've been working on. We've actually been working on this project since the middle of October, but much of our work to date has really been with a lot of interviews, which you'll hear you more about as we go forward. I'm then at the end of the presentation just going to do a quick look at what the next steps are in the process. In case people decide not to stay for the breakout groups, you'll at least know where we're going. Then we're moving into the breakout group period, and there are 5 questions. We're going to give you as much time as we can to discuss them. It may not be quite 55 to 60 minutes, it may be more like 50, but we'll make sure that you have time to discuss them. Each group will have a facilitator, and then we do promise we're going to close this meeting at 9 o'clock. Next slide, please. So a little overview on housing production plans. Many of you may be familiar with this, but go ahead, Catherine, next slide, please. So a housing production plan, it's a term of art. I usually just call it a housing plan because to me, that's what it is. But it's a plan that is recognized by the Department of Housing and Community Development with the Commonwealth of Massachusetts that encourages communities to work toward and stay above the 10% affordable housing minimum under Chapter 40B. It contains strategies to address affordable housing needs of people who live in your community, people who work in town for local businesses or town government, people with children in your schools, and people looking for a home or an apartment in Brookline, even if they don't have a current connection somehow to the community. And of course, it's also a plan to make sure that people have access equitably to housing choices in a non-discriminatory way and choices throughout a community. Next slide, please. Chapter 40B, which is the parent law of the Housing Production Plan rule, is actually the regional planning statute. It is the same law that formed the Metropolitan Area Planning Council and other regional planning agencies in Massachusetts. And it might help you to understand that that is the framework for the law, which was added about 5 years after the statute itself was passed. And so the reason it's in the regional planning law is so people kind of will understand that the law is really about addressing regional need. It's not just about Brookline's need, it's about Brookline's place within the larger Boston metro area labor market. So that's why it's in the regional planning law. And we, as practitioners with Chapter 40B, always have to kind of keep that in view and try to help our communities understand that framework as well. Next slide, please. There are reasons to have a housing production plan, which Brookline at the town government level is very aware of. If you implement that plan, you get some incentives from the state to continue doing so. If you produce a certain number of units in a year, you may get a year or two in which the Board of Appeals, which is the permitting authority under Chapter 40B, they may get a year or two in which they don't have to act on any Chapter 40B applications because the town has met its regional fair share, if you will. Brookline actually earned a 2-year certification in 2018 because of the incredible amount of work that your Board of Appeals had done. And I've had the privilege of working with them on many of those Chapter 40B applications, and they really have done an absolutely fabulous job. The fact is that you're very close to 10% now, and we'll probably get there at some point this year. And so the question for this plan is, well, so what's next? If in fact the town reaches or exceeds that 10%, what are the questions that need to be wrestled with on a going forward basis about housing needs in Brookline? And so that is kind of a prominent picture in this plan than would have been the case in 2016. Next slide, please. There are 3 main sections to every housing plan. Those of you who know the 2016 one, this will probably be old hat for you. The heart of every housing plan is the needs assessment. It's what are the needs that are in your community? Who lives in your town today? What is the makeup of your housing stock? What are the barriers to building housing in the community? And what is the capacity to do that development? There are goals in a housing plan. Some of them are numeric. How many units do we want to try to produce? And then the other types of goals are qualitative. It's like, what kind of housing do we want? And who are we really trying to help? And then, of course, implementation strategies, which is, this is what we've said we need, this is what we want, and then how are we going to do it? And so typically those strategies involve things like zoning or other kinds of policy changes, identification of areas that would make sense for more housing, what kind of housing you would like to see, and then are there opportunities to partner with other communities in the region or other groups in the region to try to address needs within Brookline. So those kinds of sections are in the last plan and they will be in this plan as well. Next slide, please. So some people talk about affordable housing as capital A, lowercase a. I don't talk about it that way. And I don't actually think most housing policy analysts do either. We think about affordable housing. And so there are different ways to think about affordability for whom. Under Chapter 40B, the definition is fairly easy to understand. It's housing that's affordable to households whose incomes are at or below 80% of what's called the area median income. So getting back to that idea that Chapter 40B is about regional need, you're in part of the Boston metro area, and it's the median income for that larger Boston metro area that determines eligibility for housing in Brookline, in Arlington, in Milton, and all the towns that make up the Boston metro area. So it's quite a large area. And then, of course, the housing also has to be safe. It has to be suitable for the size of the household that lives in it and protected by a long-term deed restriction so that the units remain affordable over time. Brookline, fortunately, also has an inclusionary zoning ordinance, or bylaw rather, which has been rather successful. And it reaches somewhat different income limits as well. So, of course, on a rental side, it serves the same household incomes that count under Chapter 40B. On the homeownership side, the income limits can go up to 120% of the Boston area median, and the town kind of computes that every year and publishes it on the website. Those units that are over 80% of what we call AMI don't count on the Chapter 40B inventory, but they do address a local need. And that is why the town has these 2 different sets of income limits for the inclusionary zoning bylaws to make sure that a lot of needs are addressed, not only those that are recognized under Chapter 40B. Next slide, please. So a unit will count if, again, if it's affordable to households at or below 80% of median income. If the units are approved before they have come to the Board of Appeals, if they're approved by Mass Housing, which is the agency that usually is the parent of what's called a project eligibility letter. There are other agencies that do it too, but there has to be a housing subsidizing agency involved in some way, that there is a long-term deed restriction in place, and that there is an affirmative fair housing marketing plan that determines how the units will be marketed. So those are the basic ingredients of, will this unit count on the Chapter 40B subsidized housing inventory? And I hope I don't start slipping too much into acronyms, but if you hear me say SHI, I mean the subsidized housing inventory. Next slide, please. Just to give you a little frame of reference, these are the income limits that I'm referring to. The US Department of Housing and Urban Development publishes income limits every year at the so-called 30%, 50%, and 80% limits. These are really gradations of low or very low or extremely low income. And of course, Brookline, as I mentioned, for home ownership units will allow affordability up to 120% of median. And so those income limits are on here as well. I just want to underscore that Brookline's inclusionary zoning also reaches, into much lower income limits too, such as those which are eligible under Chapter 40B. So your own zoning is actually meeting a broader range of needs. Next slide, please. So why is this plan important? Well, I'm a planner and I think planning is important just as a matter of principle, but I think in this case for you folks, because you're so close to 10%, and we'll probably be over it soon, having this conversation now about where are we going matters. What is the future of affordable housing in Brookline? And then as I think you all know, and we certainly have picked up on it, there's a lot of tension in Brookline around housing, how it's developed, where, who's going to live in it, who profits from it. Should every neighborhood have it, or should it be targeted in certain locations that have certain kinds of amenities? Who gets to live in it, and whether more housing kind of benefits or harms the economy and town finances. There's a lot of things that are in play. And we're trying to understand all of those things so that the plan we write for you will work for your town. So these are reasons why that plan is just very important, we think, for your community. And clearly you did too, because you decided to embark on an update of the previous plan. Next slide, please. So a little bit of looking back, when we started this, a number of people said, well, the town hasn't done anything with the 2016 plan, so why are we doing this? Well, the reality is the town has done a lot. And I think that sometimes, when you're in the middle of it or it's going on for 5 or 6 years, it's easy to lose sight of just how much a community has done. So I just want to touch on that a little bit of the things that have taken place. Next slide, Catherine. So the recommendations in the last plan fell into sort of 4 broad categories, and we'll talk about what was done really at a very summary level, just in the interest of time. But the recommendations fell into these categories: regulatory reform, resource allocation. In other words, how is the town going to invest in affordable housing development? How is it going to staff capacity? That's resource allocation. Education and advocacy, what's being done to help the community understand local need. And then policy and planning, what other kinds of initiatives will the town undertake? Next slide, please. So on the comprehensive permit side, I mean, this was really my entree to Brookline, was working with your Board of Appeals. And I brag about your ZBA all the time, because I honestly cannot think of another Board of Appeals in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts that has done what yours has done, and done so well. So as of this point, there are 13 approved Chapter 40B comprehensive permits since the last plan, with a combined total of 948 subsidized housing inventory units. That is an impressive achievement by anybody's measure. There are 5 more pending right now with a combined total of 408 units. Only 1 comprehensive permit since 2016 has been appealed by a developer to what's called the State Housing Appeals Committee, which I won't dwell on except to point out that part of the Chapter 40B law involves having an entity that can handle some appeals from developers, on sort of an administrative level. So people often think that developers just run to the HAC and get approvals. That's actually not always the case. Brookline has managed in almost every case to negotiate something that a developer was willing to live with. And so there's been really very little appeal activity to the HAC. On the zoning side, town meetings approved an accessory dwelling unit bylaw. The inclusionary zoning bylaw has been amended a couple of times to extend those benefits to more types of developments. Off-street parking requirements, as I think you probably all know, were recently reduced. And zoning has been amended to facilitate what we call micro units. So there have been some zoning initiatives that were undertaken, which is great. Next slide, please. Resource allocation. The town has done an enormous amount to invest in projects of various types. $6.5 million to help develop and expand the Housing Authority's Colonel Floyd Apartments, money for Senior Life's 108 Center Street project, money for the Two Life Communities at 370 Harvard Street, and the list goes on. Again, this is a very impressive record for any community. Brookline has done a lot to invest in the provision of affordable housing in your community. So these are just examples. Next slide, please. In other initiatives, the town adopted the Community Preservation Act. There's a planning process underway for senior units at the Kent Station Street parking lot. The town has put $3.7 million into housing preservation for development. There's a multifamily housing study underway at the staff level, really looking at the town's zoning to identify and potentially address some barriers in the existing zoning that make it difficult to do multifamily housing. And then the town also took the steps nobly to reduce the amount of what's called local preference to 25% from what had been 70% in order to encourage a more racially diverse applicant pool for the affordable units in your community. Local preference simply means that some people get more of an advantage in the lottery process. Many communities try to do as much of that as they can for quote local people. Brookline said, let's take a different approach and try to expand eligibility for more people who want to live in this community, even if they've not currently, have some connection to the town. Next slide, please. Housing preservation, again, an impressive track record. The town has worked with developers to extend affordability for 725 affordable units. Brookline is a recipient of community development block grant funds and has invested that money in housing modernization and capital repairs for nonprofits and the Housing Authority. The town plays an active role in overseeing the resale of homeownership units that are affordable in terms of the marketing process and lotteries. And then, of course, as I think many people know, the Housing Authority has done quite a bit, really sort of renowned for its efforts to preserve and modernize its federally funded developments, for which there are, of course, resources available. That's not always the case with the state funded housing, but where there are resources, the Housing Authority has been very proactive in trying to upgrade their buildings. Next slide, please. So in the course of working on the housing needs assessment, we've tried to get a little update on sort of the demographics and the housing count in town and sort of what's happening in the community and, how are people faring just in terms of their economic position. So I want to cover a little bit here about what we've learned so far. Next slide, please. This is really a summary slide of what we've learned. I have a couple of findings here that I want to share. Housing that's suitable and affordable for families with children, and in particular, low and moderate income families. We heard this over and over again in interviews with people, that the town has done a lot to support senior housing, all of which is important, and we're not saying it isn't, but there's a lot of concern about the inadequate supply of housing for families. Homeownership opportunities for moderate income folks, for housing search assistance for very low income households, people with disabilities, and householders with limited English proficiency. We heard a lot about this as well. And funding for major capital improvements at state-funded public housing developments. I underscore the tenants need help, and they have spoken with us loudly and clearly about the housing conditions that they're living with and how difficult it is to do anything about them. Next slide, please. Removing regulatory barriers to multifamily development is a critical need. Suitability for more housing development and density throughout the neighborhoods in Brookline, so that there are equitable choices at both income tiers and also geographically. And then a framework for balancing fiscal impact, which I know everybody's concerned in Brookline. People are concerned about it, legitimately so. There has to be a way to balance that with other legitimate planning and community development concerns. Not every type of development is going to provide a tremendous fiscal benefit to your community, but there are other kinds of community benefits, and we think the town really needs a way to kind of balance those. And that's one of the things we're going to be addressing in this plan. Next slide, please. So 2020 snapshot, kind of what you can see from in comparison, there's not much data available right now, folks. You probably know this, but census 2020, we hardly have any information at all. It's mostly what's needed for the redistricting purposes. But what we can see is that the white population in town has declined a bit, which is not uncommon in many Boston area communities. The Asian populations have increased significantly. The Black population grew, but because of other changes happening within the town's demographics, it's actually a slightly smaller percentage of the total today than it was before. And the Hispanic or Latino communities also have increased. It represents 6.8% of the total population compared with 5% a decade ago. So there are changes happening within the population in addition to the fact that the total population is growing. Next slide, please. The number of families in Brookline has grown faster than the total number of households. So from the Census Bureau's perspective, there are two types of households. There are families and there are non-families. And so the family households in Brookline have increased faster, and that's not true in every town we've worked in the greater Boston area. Your most recent estimates from the Census Bureau show that families make up over just over half of all households, with non-families just under half. And that is different from what we saw before. The total number of households rose by about 5.7%. Families account for almost all that growth. And just to be clear, the fact that something's a family doesn't mean it has children under 18. It simply means it could be married couples. It can be families whose children are grown. So I just want to make that clear. But family households have increased more rapidly than other types of households. Married couples continue to account for most families. About 46% have children under 18, and there's no change for that. And then people under 18 make up about 19% of the total population. Next slide, please. Older adults in Brookline, that number has also increased, not surprisingly. That's a national trend. Women who are 65 or over make up about 2/3 of all senior householders living alone. They continue to have the lowest median household income of all household types in Brookline. The median household income of single women who are 65 and over is 16% of the median family income of married couples with children under 18. There is a significant income gap in your town between certain types of households, and it seems to be growing. Next slide, please. This map is just, you probably can't read the legend, it's rather small, but you can probably appreciate that the darker the color in the map, the higher the income. So just think about that. Over half of all married couples with children under 18 have annual incomes over $200,000 a year. The median family income of all married couples with children is 4 times that of single women with children. Single women with children comprise 14% of all families in Brookline, and over 40% of them have annual incomes below $35,000 a year. Again, there's a significant income gap, and it is growing. Next slide, please. There are differences in the wealth of households by race. And you can kind of see, I'm not going to read this off the entire thing, but you can see that the white households, for example, make up roughly 3/4 of the households in town. Their income, their aggregate income, all the income of those households makes up almost 80% of the aggregate for the town as a whole. And you can see even white, non-Hispanic or Latino households are a slightly smaller percentage, but still have a greater percentage of the total income of all households in town. So your white households continue overall to have the greatest amount of wealth in the community, even as the racial makeup of the population and the households as a whole continues to change. Next slide, please. Just over half of the households kind of are renters. That has not changed. Your rental vacancy rate is only 4.4%, and for sale housing, it's extremely low. It's 1.8%. So your housing market is really tight, which I'm sure you already know. Most of your renters, most of your householders, period, are 1 or 2 person households. They're not large households. Yes, you have families with kids, but you also have a lot of very small households. Your housing inventory is richly diverse. You have many types of structures, and yet interestingly, you have these two housing types that make up a plurality of the housing in town. It's the single family detached, and it's large buildings with 50 units or more. So all the other types of housing in your community make up smaller percentages than that. So you have this kind of interesting dichotomy. No question that the neighborhoods are very diverse and there's rich architectural styles and so forth. But in terms of just the number of units and structures, you have these two extremes, and then everything else falls in between. Next slide, please. Housing affordability, this is scary. So when we worked on your housing plan 5 or 6 years ago, it was kind of a lot to swallow just to see a median sale price for single family homes of almost 1.6. Well, as of last year, it was, 2.1, over $2.1 million. And we just kind of put this up to sort of show you in comparison to the other towns around you, including towns that tend to be seen kind of throughout the Boston area as perhaps the wealthiest communities in Massachusetts, communities like Weston and Wellesley. Your median single family sale price is higher than all of those. So it would be hard for people to find a home that they could afford in Brookline today. It would probably be hard for many of you who live there now to find a place that you could afford if you were buying into Brookline for the first time. Next slide, please. There's a concept in housing policy called housing cost burden. And what it means is that for households who are low or moderate income, if they're paying more than 30% of their gross monthly income for housing, they're considered to be unaffordably housed. In other words, they're paying more for housing that they probably can afford. And I just wanted to put this table up to show you. HUD measures this in different income tiers. And Brookline is like so many other communities I've worked in, where the percentage of people with high housing cost burdens is actually not the lowest income tier. It's in the middle between the people who have very, very low incomes and the people who are considered sort of lower income up to that sort of 80% of median. It's the 31 to 50% group. And my experience is that often for those households, they may have a little bit too much to actually get into public housing. There's not enough Section 8 assistance to go around. And so they're sort of stuck. And so you have 84% of the households in that income group are unaffordably housed. And almost 60% of them are what we call severely cost burdened, which is they're paying over half their income on housing every single month just to live in Brookline. So there is significant need in your community, forgetting about regional need, just looking at the town itself. There is significant need among people who have lower incomes. Next slide, please. Your rents are really high, no surprise to any of you, I'm sure. We looked at sort of the overall inventory, both older units and newer ones, just the whole mix. And the median rent is about $2,400 a month. Of course, for newer units, it's much higher. That's just the midpoint of all units that might be on the market at any given time. So the rents are very high, and you can appreciate why people who are lower income probably are unaffordably housed. There's a real mismatch between income and housing costs in Brookline. It's most problematic for low income people. People who are applying to the lotteries for affordable housing are paying a very high proportion of their income on rent and utilities. And this we know not only from your town staff, but interviewing one of the firms that does a lot of your housing lotteries. Low-income families with children are the most vulnerable to homelessness in Brookline, as we understand it. They, along with lower income older adults and people with disabilities, have the highest needs. Next slide, please. There's simply not enough affordable housing to go around, especially on the rental side. The volume of affordable units at any affordable level is low, especially when you consider that at least under Chapter 40B and even your own inclusionary zoning ordinance, unless it is a project being done by a nonprofit developer who's bringing a lot of subsidy in, the number of affordable units in a given development may only be 25% of the total. So you're getting some affordability and a lot of higher cost housing stock. It's very hard for people who want to even get into Brookline to to get through the lottery. Applications from income eligible applicants can be 100 times the number of affordable units or available units rather. And this can be very discouraging to people. And we have a little bit of data about that coming up. Next slide, please. So the supply is clearly out of sync. We just looked at 3 recent projects that we were able to get data for. So, you know, for 455 Harvard, there were 552 applicants for the affordable units. The 9 lease signings for which we have data, you know, just pales in significance. It's just nowhere near what the demand was. And similarly for 45 Marion and the Calvin, the number of applications is way ahead of the number of units that could actually be leased to people who applied. And then I think the other thing that's kind of interesting is that even as Brookline has taken steps to reduce local preference, what you can see is that local preference really does drive a lot of the lease signings kind of out of proportion with the local preference applicants in the applicant pool. So it's really hard for people who want to live in Brookline to even be able to get access there at all. Next slide, please. The housing search process is daunting at best. We heard so many stories about this. I was in an interview with someone who just did this eloquent description of what it's like for people who don't understand the list and trying to find out how many lists are there. People don't understand what the rules are. They don't know how many lists there are. Is there a list for every development? Why can't we just get our name on one list? There are sometimes mistakes made, understandably, but you know, when you're the one who's against whom the mistake has occurred, it's just very frustrating. There's a lack of information about tenant rights, especially for people with disabilities, and just really generally too many people applying for the same inadequate supply of housing. So over on the left, you can just see some examples of what people have said about how they even found out that there were affordable units available. My kid's school counseling told me to apply. It's really hard for people who are trying to find housing to know where to begin. Next slide, please. Home buying opportunities are not published as we understand it in the Housing Authority newsletter. If any of these statements are incorrect, I just want you to know we heard them from people who are being interviewed, and perception matters. Website and emails are only in English. We need information about financing options. We don't know where to get it. There's really not enough support for people who are uncomfortable with technology or who don't have internet access to even know how to do the search. There's no point person to help them. There's a need for volunteer translators and interpreters when your language isn't English and you're trying to wade through complicated forms and an application process that's all in English. And also there's no daycare apparently that accepts vouchers. So child care services in Brookline are private. They don't accept the vouchers. So where do public housing children go for daycare? There's a lot of needs and issues that we heard about in our interviews. Next slide, please. The public housing waitlist is huge. These statistics are from your most recent 5-year consolidated plan for HUD funds. 7,700 households are in line waiting for a placement with the Brookline Housing Authority. If you're a local person and you're a senior, your wait might be up to 3 years, but you could be waiting 10 years if you're outside Brookline. The average wait list for families is 6 years, 2,100 people on the wait list for Section 8. It just goes on. The demand is enormous and the inventory is not there to support it. Next slide, please. We've spoken with over 100 people since we started working on this in the middle of October. We've heard so many stories. I wish I could begin to share them all with you. But generally, these are things that we heard, and we heard them fairly consistently. The people of color don't feel welcome in Brookline, and they mentioned everything from issues with the police to health services, lack of opportunity, or a perception of, and in fact, we don't know, discrimination at the schools. Housing Authority tenants reported poor or substandard conditions and delayed maintenance. And many of them don't feel like they really belong in the Brookline community. Many of them have talked about being just isolated and the feeling of economic segregation. They sometimes feel stigmatized. Many people raise concerns about college student renters and their impact on Brookline's housing market. Next slide, please. One person eloquently pointed out that in Brookline today, zoning is how we exclude people. It needs to be how we include them. Should the town consider things like eliminating single-family districts? Developers reported needing a clearer process for how to navigate permitting and how to sort of find out what the town even wants and how to negotiate with town officials. Many interviewees said town officials don't really understand affordable housing. They don't understand AMI thresholds. They don't understand eligibility. This again are perceptions from people who are engaged at some level with the housing situation in Brookline. Should local preference be expanded to neighborhoods abutting Brookline, given that there are people just kind of outside, right, immediate outside the town who would like to live there? You have a lot of neighborhood groups, interest groups, advocacy organizations, and they're not always working in the same direction. Next slide, please. So I'm going to just talk a little bit about next steps, and then we're going to go into the breakouts. Next slide, Catherine. We're in this schedule. We're in now the community forum phase and working on the wrapping up the needs assessment. We're going to be moving soon into what is being called the location-based prototypes. It's going to be looking at different neighborhoods in Brookline and where different types of housing and different forms would make sense. We'll be periodically updating the Housing Advisory Board at their meetings. We anticipate finishing up a final draft of the HPP, Housing Production Plan, excuse me, around June. Probably will go to the Select Board and Planning Board either over the summer or right after that, around Labor Day, and then would be submitted to DHCD. Next slide, please. We will be doing a community survey. It will be available shortly. It will be available on the town's Housing Production Plan website. It will also be available translated in the same languages that are being offered this evening. It's not going to be open very long. It is very similar to the survey that was done for the 2016 housing plan so that we can compare the results. Next slide, please. There are more meetings coming up on February 22nd. There will be a bit of a report back on tonight, where we're going to be focusing more on urban design and visualization, thinking about goals for the plan, how we might measure progress, and hear new ideas from your community. So that'll be a different format meeting than tonight's. Next slide, please. We are going to move into the breakout groups at this point. You're going to magically be all moved in a few minutes. If you can just go to the next slide, Catherine, that would be great. You're all going to be assigned randomly, except participants who've requested a group with a language interpreter. If you want to join a group with an interpreter and you didn't get a chance to tell us ahead of time, that's my fault. But you can contact Catherine through the chat box, and she will move you to an interpreter group as soon as everyone else has been assigned. So don't be afraid to use the chat to get hold of us. Next slide, please. There are 5 discussion questions. We'd like you to try to address all of them. If you can't, that's okay. Just the quality of discussion matters more than getting through all 5 questions. Everyone will get a chance to speak, which may be chat, maybe speaking, it may be both. But we want to make sure everybody gets a chance to be heard before someone speaks twice. We're going to ask you to listen to what people have to say and be curious about what they say and engage. And don't just sort of jump to your own opinion if you disagree, but just listen to each other and of course respond and engage. And if you can, try to build agreement. If you can't, no penalty, but we'd love to know where people think they can reach agreement about ideas. Next slide, please. There are 5 questions. They're on this slide. You'll obviously be walked through these in the breakouts. I want to just point out again, if you're watching this, but not on Zoom, but you're seeing it through Brookline Interactive, you can respond to the same questions, these 5. There is a Google form on the Housing Production Plan website, which is on the town webpage, and you can access that form through a link, and you can respond to the questions. And so we want to hear what you have to say. We'll leave it up, as I said, for probably 24 hours, and then we'll be taking it down and comparing it with what people told us this evening. Daphne, do you want to add anything before we move on here?
Thanks, Judy. Just that I just wanted to emphasize what Judy said, that it's not only about providing your thoughts, but it's also about listening to other people's and allowing that to maybe expand the way you think about things, just to be open to that possibility, as this is a community and this is a community conversation. So to be respectful of one another and also to enjoy meeting one another and listening to different perspectives.
So my colleague Catherine Dennison is going to start moving people into breakout rooms at this point. And we will bring you all back for those of you who choose to stay, really just for some closing remarks at about 9:05. So if you disappear momentarily, you're going to find yourself in a breakout room in a few minutes. Catherine, I think this is your cue.
Excellent. I'm just getting them finished setting them up. So please excuse just a momentary pause.
While Catherine is doing that, I just wanted to say that if someone would like to access a Spanish language, a Russian language, Cantonese, or Mandarin group to speak there, then you need to go to the chat, and where it says everyone, click on that and look for Catherine. And then you can directly text her in the chat and let her know where you would like to be. And just so you know, Catherine is now assigning you to breakout rooms, and they will be facilitated. You'll have someone there walking you through the questions. Bear with us, just a little bit of technical difficulty.
This is that moment in a public meeting, folks, when you sort of gasp, when there's a technical problem that you didn't think was going to happen. So just hold on.
And don't worry, because we do have a backup plan.
While we're waiting, it bears repeating that the slides are going to be available on the town's website, right?
Yes.
Yes.
And that while you're waiting, if you haven't already done it, you can sign up for notifications about the housing production plan also on the town website.
And also someone is asking for the link to the Google form in the chat. Alexis, are you able to do that?
Yep, I will go right ahead and do that.
So it's time for the backup plan. So the backup plan is that
Oh,
we're going
wait.
to all be together.
Oh, actually,
It looks like I'm being invited to join a group, so I think
Okay,
we're
perfect.
good.
Just
Sorry,
in time, just in time.
No, it didn't work. I'm sorry.
Oh,
all
okay.
right, so
So
backup
the
plan.
backup plan is we'll all be together and that way everyone gets to see what everyone has to say. So this means that we will really have to stick to discussion in the chat.
Yep.
And maybe at the very end, open it up to some verbal input. So let's all be together. in one
Thank you,
space.
everyone, for your patience, and thank you, Catherine, for trying. I know that had to be a very stressful moment.
Can you just pause for one moment? The breakout rooms aren't quite done coming back. There are some people who joined them already.
Oh,
All right, let's see if everybody's back.
Okay.
All right, it looks like 7
Catherine,
seconds.
Don't
7
worry,
seconds.
fine. It's A-okay. We are good.
so it looks like Alexis put the link to the Google Forms in the chat.
Yep.
So you can start to be thinking about what you might want to respond to that first question. Do some groups of people in Brookline have a more difficult time than others finding housing that meets their needs? And that would be including but not limited to housing affordability. Oh, Naomi, stay, because we're going to be just one group.
Yeah, we're bringing everybody back.
Please stay, Naomi.
Yeah. We're sorry, folks. Rehearsed as this was, it just didn't work.
Thank you, Emily.
Yes.
So you can start, whoever's here, you can start typing your response to that question, the first question. Who has a more difficult time? Thanks, Ellen, for starting it.
Yes. Do some groups of people in Brookline have a more difficult time than others finding housing that meets their needs, including but not limited to affordability?
We're supposed to put this in the chat. I missed that part.
Yes,
Yes.
please, Linda.
Yes,
Okay.
we have to do that, Linda. So that would be great. Thank you. And we'll monitor it and we'll kind of keep track of what's being said.
So it's non-white and immigrant communities, families of color, low-income working class families, BIPOC community members, low-income communities.
Yes,
So far, there's a lot of consistency.
yes.
And people with disabilities, that was discussed earlier in the chat as well.
People without networks. Yep.
People of all races, spending too much on housing.
Young families with children.
Large families. We've heard that in the interviews as well.
Good, we heard that. So Maria, you were kicked out of the chat room because it didn't work. So we're all back together.
Oh, okay. All right. We were starting to chat. We were kind of having a good time.
Oh,
Technical problems, just,
That's okay. It's huge. This is a huge endeavor. But Judy, I just have to say that was just a fabulous presentation. It was powerful.
thank you.
It really was powerful.
So we have lots of comments. Anyone with income less than $100,000 might not capture what low means. Low income might not capture. Katha, I agree with you. Single people have.
Nona, you might want to also type the question in Russian, as the others have done.
I see. Single people, most of the new housing is large units. People who need small units, such as older, younger singles or young couples without large incomes. Middle-class families. It's a major issue, but the racial results are disappointing but not surprising.
Someone would like to broaden the question. Naomi would. People outside of Brookline who might want to live here can't get in, and this
Mhm.
disproportionately impacts people of color with low incomes who are not in Brookline.
Right. And we've been trying to get a handle on that through data that we were able to get from one of the lottery agents. It's probably certainly an incomplete sample, but it was some insight. We're trying to get more.
And if seniors can't downsize, then their 2 large houses will not become available. Minimum wage workers.
Single women. Yep.
People who work in town.
Yep. I'm concerned about how we balance affordable housing crisis and our desire to be good citizens with the given realities. I found the info on what Brookline has done on housing fascinating and impressive, more than I realized.
And they hope that residents become aware of this information, hopefully by putting it on the website.
Yes.
That will increase visibility.
This is so helpful, folks. Thank you. Almost anybody, either without family wealth or extraordinarily high income. Teachers, especially teachers of color.
Older buildings are torn down to build large luxury units.
People displaced when redevelopment happens and older buildings are torn down to build large luxury units. We have heard that too.
People who make 40K a year or less. So the question is, do some groups of people in Brookline have a more difficult time than others finding housing that meets their needs, including but not limited to housing affordability? Someone asked what the question is. Oh, and the website is not a great way to increase visibility. Need to bring it to where people congregate. PTO, seniors facilities. A point well taken.
Yeah.
Lower middle income groups that are disproportionately not white. Use the press, the Globe. The constraints about parking with senior residents. So why don't we move to the next question? And maybe Emily, you can do that again to try to create a picture or an image of Brookline at its very best in terms of accommodating a range of housing needs and hopes. What would the town be like? What would it look like? Try to describe it. The lack of public transit in Sobro constrains low-income development across the town. So I guess that would mean to expand public housing, public transit, sorry. More safe and well-maintained public housing specifically for families, housing cooperatives and mutual housing associations, rent control, good cause eviction, tenant bill of rights, more diverse, vibrant, and interconnected community. Quite a vision. Yeah, people are agreeing.
Yes.
Sarah Lynn is jumping ahead to number 5, but we'll be sure to note that. Thank you. More density, housing in commercial districts.
These are great answers. Look at this.
Yeah. Housing for lowest income residents that's decent and safe and not run down and dilapidated. More or less flat distribution of numbers of people at each income level. much more density, demolition of insufficient dense commercial and residential plots, housing combined with childcare. More density, but with livability, not profit as the design motive.
Housing combined with childcare would be great.
That would be great in all communities at all levels,
Sure would. Yes.
especially post-COVID when women were so disproportionately hit.
Yeah. Quality and safe Brookline Housing Authority housing.
Public transportation, safe pedestrian and biking opportunities. Alteration of zoning to allow more multifamily housing in single-family neighborhoods. I wonder, does anyone disagree with that? That the zoning should be changed to allow more multifamily housing in single-family neighborhoods? Does anyone disagree with that? And please tell us why if you do.
Absolutely should allow more multifamily housing.
And
Agree.
Someone agrees. Does anyone disagree?
So far, no.
Well, there's agreement.
Yep. Yep. Better integration with surrounding neighborhoods.
More density. So far, there seems to be agreement,
Mhm.
but this
Depends on the definition and scale of, I'm sorry, Deb, I'm speaking over you. I apologize.
okay. It's just that there was a concern about keeping it to the scale of the community.
Mhm. That's what I was going to read too.
Oh.
So better distributed throughout the town's neighborhoods. Not high rises.
Smaller units, or
Mhm.
retail housing combos.
Yep,
So
yep.
mixed use. Lower units with multifamily. So there seems to be a concern about scale and also a lot of support for for mixed use. Make it simple for mother-in-law suites, use of garage space. So the ADU that recently passed, apparently, according to some, does not make it simple. So I think that's what that's about. The question about the single family is, someone said that there should be a change to the zoning to allow more multifamily in single family only districts now, that are now only that. Does anyone disagree with that? Does anyone think that the single family zoning districts should remain such?
Plenty of underutilized, often dilapidated plots or buildings that should be replaced with mixed use. Developer requirements when they convert two families to three.
Then someone has a suggestion about, so what we were thinking, the stack system, say 30 seconds on the mic. Yeah, so what we were thinking was at the end to give everyone a chance to talk. We just wanted to get through all of the questions. That's to Ryan. Thank you for that suggestion. The other thing is we could take a moment here and at the end of all of the chat for each of the questions, open it up a little bit.
I'm fine with that.
Yeah, Ryan, would you like to say something?
Oh, I'm good for now. I was just suggesting that in case that would help the facilitators.
Thank you. So is there someone who would like to say something about their vision of Brookline at its very best? So if not, then perhaps we move on to number 3.
Sure.
What
Criteria.
criteria-
You go ahead.
So what criteria should be considered in the housing plan for locating more affordable housing? Are some types of locations better than others? And if so, why? So we need to think more broadly about transportation as well. We shouldn't simply rely on public transportation for locales of dense properties. We might require developers to include shuttles, for example. That's an interesting idea.
I just unmuted myself to make a
Thank you,
comment. I
Deborah.
didn't do it fast enough when you said it earlier.
So go ahead. Go
I
ahead.
think there's just a tension between, you know, seeing so much development that is profit oriented, and it's just, you know, taking 2 families, 3 families that have housed, you know, very moderate income families, and then just, you know, bringing them to the heights of what they can do. You know, there's limitations because of zoning, but, you know, there's several in my neighborhood. I mean, they made 2 big units and put elevators in, you know, all kinds of things taking up a lot of the lot. And also high, you know, we haven't had that much, I don't think, high rise expensive housing, but that's certainly happening all over Boston. So how can you, you know, how can you encourage development that isn't just that wealthy kind of development? And that's what I see all around us.
How can you encourage sort of non-luxury development?
Yeah, I don't think it should be driven by people's profits, but that's what it is.
Thank you for that. Anyone else like to say something verbally?
These comments are so helpful.
So people are talking about the need to access public transit, and there had been a couple of comments about expanding public transit in areas where there's less of it. How do people feel about that? So more housing near T-stops is one way of looking at it. The other way is more T-stops or more bus stops near where housing could be developed. What do people think about that?
You're just shuffling employees around.
What's that, Ruth Ann?
Oh dear. I'm feeling rather cynical, and I hope I don't regret saying this publicly, but unless we address or at least acknowledge the influence that the medical pharmaceutical industry has on our community, this whole exercise could be really very futile. Because I believe, and I think this is true, that they demand their highly paid specialists to live within a certain area around the hospitals. And so they take their very best and they want them nearby, and that their very best, which they pay terrifically, want to come to Brookline for our schools and our libraries. And I don't blame them. It's a wonderful place to live, but how can we deal with that when they're so affluent, they're paid so well? And the hospitals demand that they live nearby.
Thank you for that.
I hope so.
And that didn't sound cynical to me.
Thank you.
So there was a comment here about creating dedicated bus lanes,
right,
so that there would be more access to other parts of town, to public transit, and safer bike paths that are needed. So there's a point being made here that the hospitals actually don't demand that their providers live near the hospitals, but the doctors may choose to live there in Brookline because of the convenience, and of course, as Ruth Ann pointed out, because of the good schools.
Oh, there's a point that some people are raising their hands. Thank you. Let's see if we can.
Well, thank you, Alexis.
So, someone, I can't take credit. Someone pointed it out in the chat. So I'm just trying to see. So it looks like
You get credit
Alice.
for seeing it in the chat, Alexis.
Oh, let's see.
I see 2 people have raised their hands.
And Alice.
Hi, should I speak for 3 seconds?
You can go
ahead, Alice.
Thank you.
Awesome. Okay, so I'm here with like a group of students, and we're really like concerned about the housing crisis in Brookline and really passionate about affordable housing. So we think this is so interesting. something, a question that was raised is like, how do we have more affordable housing, but not just luxury condos? How do we make sure there are there is zoning reform without it just turning into luxury condos? And something we've been talking about is like an affordable housing overlay, because that allows developers to have exemptions from zoning laws, but with the caveat that it is affordable, that it meets certain percent of the AMI. So I don't know, that was just an idea and we were thinking, what do people think about that? Because that's something we've been talking a lot about.
Thank you, Alice.
Thank you.
Anyone want to respond to what Alice just proposed, an affordable housing overlay district?
That's basically, Mike Sandon, that's basically what 40B does. And so once we're eligible, there's no requirement under state law. We would need to do something locally in order to make that possible.
And I think that's what Alice was, I think that's what she was suggesting.
So we have other people with their hands raised. Kalimba Clark? Did you want to speak? Or let's see, Deborah Brown. You have your hand raised. Did you want to speak?
I did. I'm sorry.
Hi, Deborah.
Hi. This is I enjoyed your presentation, but I think if we're serious about affordable housing, then one of the things that has to happen is that the town itself has to invest more in affordable housing. And that means floating bonds for affordable housing. I know that's not particularly attractive for a lot of people. I think that there has to be a commitment to repair affordable housing. I think there are ways that we have used our CDBG money that could have been more focused on affordable housing. And I think it has to become a priority. We've got vacant lots. One of the biggest expenses in Brookline in terms of building is the cost of land. And so if you can eliminate that cost, then you create an opportunity for more affordable housing. And lastly, that I don't see is a sense of urgency. And if absent a sense of urgency, it just won't happen. So that's my two.
Thank you, Deborah.
Thank you, Deborah, so much. Kalimba, I think you were trying to speak, and if you want to try again, that would be great.
And other people agree with Deborah as well.
Yes. Kalimba, are you able to unmute and state your comments or question?
Yes, I'm here.
Thank
Okay,
you. Great.
I finally got it. I'm sorry.
That's
I
okay.
am technologically challenged. Sorry. And then I have company because it's my birthday, so I am so
happy
sorry.
birthday.
I am not trying to go ahead and rain on the committee's parade, but yes, I did want to go ahead and speak in and say that we have had the rodent and roach problem. We have had the security problem where the doors at the front are sometimes not working, or there are people that just go ahead and just buzz the door and let people in. I had just spoke the other night and said that I do laundry sometimes when I can't sleep in the middle of the night, and there was a person that was actually changing their clothing in my stairwell at the back door. So that made me feel uncomfortable. Then there's the issue about the stairs being broken, and then until we complain about it, that's when it goes ahead and gets repaired. So it's not even like just the stairs, it's just like any maintenance issue, because they tell us that it's cosmetic, when I really think that it's a safety hazard or a health hazard. I've also complained about how in our house, like I have had mold issues where there's mold around the bathtub and the caulking. So I've complained to the health department, and these are just some of the issues. So I wanted to just chime in about that. I've taken pictures. I've sent the pictures. There are other issues. Like I said, but these are my issues.
Kalimba, we really appreciate your calling, especially on your birthday. I'm very sorry to hear about these issues, and I truly, sincerely hope that something can be done to address them. But mostly, it's really important that you shed light on them and you bring them to this conversation. I really appreciate it.
Yes, and thank you, because this is why I go ahead and join the meeting, so that I can make it sure that I'm one of the voices, so that they know it's not just one person, it's all of us.
And only by hearing from you can people know. So thank you.
Yes, exactly. Thank you.
Michael? Has your hand up? Michael Wilkinson?
Yes, thank you very much. And I would agree that this has been an excellent presentation. I'd like to follow up on both Deborah's comment and the last speaker, Kalimba's comment about maintenance. And, you know, also the comments that have been about climate in terms of what an ideal Brookline would look like. And I think that that includes, and I encourage you to include this in your planning, is to be very explicit about the funding mechanisms for all of the proposals, you know, especially those funding mechanisms that are driven specifically by the town. And, you know, I believe that the town has capacity and wealth in order to help fund things like the bonds that Deborah was talking about, or more maintenance funds for public housing, as Kalimba was talking about. But I think we need to be really explicit about those, so that, for example, developers who are coming in and trying to understand the relative profits of building housing for more affluent buyers or renters, and people who have less means can weigh the profits of those things more predictably and explicitly as part of their planning and the town's planning.
And Michael, someone is pointing out in the chat that some of the ARPA funds can be used towards this end as well.
And it should obviously all be included in the plan, in your planning and presentation of a strategic plan.
Thank you.
Chandra Jones Mercer?
Hello, Shonda. Hi, good evening. Great presentation. I loved it.
Thank you.
It really hit home. Wanted to say, well, several things. As I could think of like probably 3 places in Brookline that's affordable housing. And they're not really great places to be. you got a roof over your head. And I guess that's how they accept us. As long as you got a roof over your head, you don't need to complain about anything. You're lucky you're here and you live in Brookline. And I think another thing too, I know you was talking about the houses and homes.
Mhm.
It'll be nice to see what Brookline looked like. I think it's your second question. We have something nice to have people own their homes and people of color owning their homes.
Mhm, mhm.
But it's so expensive, if they want an arm, a leg, and a kidney, just to have something you work hard for, to enjoy the fruit of your labor. I mean, I think everybody that works hard always want to have their own house. And it is so hard in Brookline to have that. If they had like classes, like a one-on-one home buying classes to help funds, to get people to classes, it's just the community getting together, and it would just open a lot of other extra things for other people as well, But so everything, I mean, you got these beautiful condos, and you're like, who can afford to live in those?
Yeah.
Like who? It's just like, what, they just want everybody to move out? Because before, I believe there was a middle class and a lower class. There is no more middle class. It's just you're poor. There's high and you're poor. There's no in between. Because you can work 8 jobs, but you would never enjoy the beauty of your home and what you got to do for it, because you're working so much just to have it. It'll be like a mantelpiece. You sit it on like a piece of sit on a corner and say, "Oh, look at my beautiful house." I can look at it, but I really can't, because I'm always working.
Right.
So you can't really enjoy it.
So Chanda, your vision of a more improved Brookline includes people of color owning their homes, making those homes affordable, and also providing information and support to know how to access them.
Yes, because I think a lot of people in the first home buying classes, if they had that extra step in how to balance and how to find a way to entering, I believe that would happen, but it's got to bring the prices down, like down.
And instead of going down, they're going up, right?
Right. It's a hard life. I mean, it's hard as it is. I mean,
It's a hard life. It's a hard life. Oops.
Yes, it is. But I
Thank you
just
so
want
much
to
for that, Chanda.
get that out there, and just I've been waiting for a voucher over 10 years. So I know. So I never got one, but I'm still putting my information in and still trying to get that. When I saw the numbers, I was like, what? So reality, when you see that, it's like, wow. So I feel it, but I'm trying to stay afloat. My feet, and I'm just like, I feel like I'm at the water, like if that's in my neck, and I'm just keep floating. I'm trying to stay at neck level.
It's just called being optimistic. That's all, because you're just trying to go ahead and make sure that you look for something good out of the bad or the messed up that's going on.
True.
So Daphne.
That's my share.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you, and for being so articulate. Thank you.
Thank you.
Daphne, just looking at the time, I'm going to be the
just going to move to the next one.
Yeah, I think we probably should move on to the next question. And folks, if you wanted to speak but didn't get a chance to, with your hands raised, just go ahead and use the chat. We're going to move on to the next question.
So if someone could type it in, please, in our various languages. What would you say are the 3 most important housing issues the plan should be sure to address? And we'll be brief on this because we want to go to the last question.
Right. Three things. Three most important housing issues. You get to name three.
Or related to housing issues. What would be the three most important things that the plan should be sure to include and address? So for example, someone earlier said to include the funding mechanisms, or they might be housing and daycare, housing and public transport. What are the three most important issues to include and address? Oh, we're getting a rain of answers.
This is great.
And if anyone would like to speak, raise your hand, please.
Just saw a question in the chat about how to raise your hand, and it's under the reactions icon. If you open the reactions icon on the bottom, there's a hand, raise hand.
Thank you so much, Jack. Providing home ownership, family housing, so that people of color can have access to schools, providing home buying classes and funding. Fixing the public housing. There's a lot of discussion about the public housing. Fran, did you want to say something?
Yes, I wanted to say something about a topic that we've passed already. Maybe I could just be brief here. I was the one concerned about the parking, particularly for senior residences. I'm located on 100 Center Street, where I'm sure you know there are already two independent senior housing buildings and a third one coming. The major thing here is there are a number of people living in these residences, including myself, who are lower income and don't own cars and move to Brookline to have easy access to be able to support merchants and so forth by walking, which I know is important to Brookline to make it more of a walking town. The problem is, particularly in situations like with the pandemic, many seniors who are quite elderly, who don't own cars, are totally isolated except for their families. There are many who have home health aides who get free passes for parking in the street that aren't for a limited time. But if a person is fortunate enough to be in good health, but elderly, depending on family and friends to visit them, 2-hour parking in the street nearby is just not ample. By the time the person finds a parking space, gets in to see the elderly relative or friend, helps them with laundry or whatever is necessary, there's really no time to then go out and have lunch or anything else they want to do. So in fact, it becomes a very pressured time without relaxation because the visitor and the tenant is worried about getting a ticket. So I know I believe there are passes that you can buy, but these people don't have cars. My proposal is to, within a walking distance, a reasonable distance, I don't mean all over Brookline to be able to have access, but let's say in 100 Center Street, with a decent walking distance, that each resident who would like one would be entitled to a free visitor pass to give to their visitor at the time they're here. Not for the visitor to be able to ride all over Brookline when they're not dealing with the resident, but so that they don't have that structure of worrying about having to be there within the 2 hours, particularly since the home health aides who have it much longer, they can walk to places easily, for example. So maybe they could go someplace a little bit farther from the building, where the resident whose visitor comes and maybe wants to take the resident in the car with them to go shopping or out to eat or whatever, they take a long time to find a parking spot in the first place. And so that's a major concern for new housing that goes up, even if they have a parking lot, which maybe not many of them will, because how many of these elderly people are still driving, I don't know. but to be able to know that they're not totally isolated because they came to Brookline to have access to be able to do all these things. So I wondered if that's something that even doesn't have to wait for new housing, but some kind of an opportunity that could be implemented sooner than later so that the people living in these buildings during the pandemic in particular don't have to feel quite so isolated.
Thank you, Fran. Thank you.
Mhm.
We have a lot of feedback here
Yeah,
on this.
so I think we should move to the last question.
Yes, we do, because we're promising people we're going to end this on time. But
Exactly,
the
so that they
second
come
we start-
back. So that
Yes,
they
that's
come
right.
So if we could please type, if you could do one thing to improve housing in Brookline, what would it be? And if we could have it in our, thank you, already it's in Cantonese and Spanish. If you could do one thing.
I want to raise my hand. I think that it's just about the communication because one department needs to go ahead and speak to the next department. And then when we have all of these issues written down that we're speaking about right now, it needs to be communicated the right way to the right people so that action can be taken, because I don't know how many meetings that we need to go ahead and have before certain things are actually like taken into consideration and being taken care of, you know. So I think it's like communication
Thank you.
needs to be like key, because we need to go ahead and have some sort of security that when we're having these meetings, that the communication is being met at the next to the next person. Then we need to go ahead and make sure that that person is being communicative to the next person, because that's the only way, is that we need to speak and the people, we need to be heard, and it just needs to be communicated the right way to the right people.
And we certainly intend to do that. Thank you very much for emphasizing it. Anyone else, if you could do one thing to improve housing in Brookline, what would it be? In the chat, or if you'd like to.
I think we have a hand raised. Yes, thank
Oh,
you.
Hi.
Thank you. I actually put it in the chat,
Oh, okay.
but I think there is a fundamental funding issue here, and there has to be equity between the municipalities with funding that's directed to communities that are being asked to provide housing. And one of the examples is Boston and Cambridge, because of their commercial development, their lab, their high tech, and so forth, have been able to increase their commercial property taxes over the past several years by hundreds of millions of dollars. Actually over $1 billion in Boston's case in additional commercial property taxes. Neither of those cities has had an override in at least 30 years. They have linkage fees, but those linkage fees, by their own studies, only cover about 4 or 5% of the needed housing subsidies. And most of the new employees who are attracted to that commercial development end up living in other communities, and those other communities don't share in those increased commercial taxes, and they have to pay for schools and municipal services. The state isn't even fully funding programs like Chapter 40S that are designed to address those issues. I think there is a fundamental state funding issue here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Anyone else? It looks like there are some more people with raised hands.
Yeah, we probably can take 2 more comments, maybe, see how the time goes.
Yeah.
maybe somebody who hasn't spoken yet.
I haven't spoken.
Sharon, hi. I was just going to say Sharon hasn't spoken yet. Go ahead.
Right. If there was something that I could change in Brookline, someone like mentioned a portion of it about, buildings going up that are luxury and, that are focused on the money. Well, in the back here, I'm speaking directly at it as an example at High Street. I've lived here many years, over 35 years. And in the back, we have, some Brookline housing buildings. Now, my daughter's friend lived in the back. Everybody, along that line, along that block had parking in front of their houses, because it's the townhouses over there. And in the back here, I went out in the back with my granddaughter playing, and I noticed there was a lever going up, how you go in the garage and the thing goes up when you put the card in or whatever. And I'm saying, well, I spoke to somebody, I said, do you guys have, does everybody have a, entry card to get in there? So what was told to me is that the people that are in the condos over there took the spaces from the Brookline housing people who lived on that block. Now the people that live in housing right there on that one block have to walk all the way down to the end of the block to park, while the people in the condos get to park directly in front of the housing authority, townhouse buildings. And that is so unfair. I said, I wished I'd known about it. They'd have heard my mouth all over Brookline. Do you know what I mean? So that has to change. That has to change. Why should, it's like it happened right in front of our eyes. And now these people that used to be able to park there can't even park in front of their own townhouses. Really? For Brookline housing. So that has to change.
So, thank you so much.
It's like a gate, a lever gate that goes up, but only the condominium people that are across the street from the Brookline housing gets to have it. Now it's like, what? My daughter's friends live there, and it's like they can't even park in front of their own places now. Do you know what I mean? So like, it's kind of like nanny boo boo, you can't park here anymore because we have it. We have the money and you don't. That's kind of like how I feel that it happened.
Thank you, Sharon, very much.
You're welcome. Mm-hmm.
I appreciate your comments.
I'm trying to lower.
Hi, Sharon.
Catherine.
Naomi? I think we can take a comment from Naomi.
Hello, Catherine.
Yeah, thank you.
Oh, sorry.
Just want to really highlight the headline, and I see a lot in the chat too around the need for affordable family housing. And I think it's on really like 3 tracks. One, we need to repair and upgrade our existing public housing, family housing, the state public housing, so that there are better conditions in those properties. We need to create more family affordable housing so that people in town and outside of town who want to live here and do here affordably and be able to live here with their children and not be strapped every month to meet their basic needs. And then we need affordable home ownership options for families as well, for our lower income residents and folks outside of town who might want to live here and who have no way to enter into this extremely expensive market. Thanks.
Thank you.
So Judy, I think Catherine has been trying to speak for a while.
Okay.
Catherine Harris, I think.
Yes, hi. Thank you. Unfortunately, I tried to get into the chat room, but everything is frozen on me tonight. I understand.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, so I couldn't make any chats at all. But I'm going to end it very shortly because I know we have to close, but I want to say I truly enjoyed myself tonight. And one of my biggest compassion is as I look around Boston and see all these homes being built, townhouses or whatever, for affordable housing. And I've lived in this town for quite some time. And one of my biggest goals was to have people to effectively listen to some of my plans or goals. We have ideas. We're not just tenants. We're tenants with a future plan. And one of my plans, being a grandmother, raising grandchildren for the last 20 years, was a big issue for me because I always have a vision in my head to have a grandparents type of townhouse where I could have raised my grandchildren. Unfortunately, some children became sick, became mentally ill, had problems, and I had to separate. I didn't want to separate, and one couple became homeless during the pandemic. That was so painful to see and hear. I mean, I could have helped the child or children, but unfortunately, due to the high demands of some of our society didn't help me to help the children, it became a big issue. So one of my goals with that ARPA money should be looked into this. I have a vision, a strong vision. Someone needs to effectively sit down with me. Let's talk about our visions. We have visions, and we just don't have the money to implement our plans, write a proposal, bring it into existing. And because I say this can happen. We can eventually own our own homes or something so we can accommodate the need. Or once a child moves out, we can bring another family into the unit or a several unit. It's like building a new little village that's gonna house grandparents raising grandchildren. They have it in Boston, in Dorchester. They built a house strictly for that. So this is just only one of my issues. So thank you for listening.
Thank you for
Catherine,
speaking.
thank you. So I just need to ask one last thing, which is some of you earlier on talked about multifamily being too tall or too big. Could you please just say what that means? What is too tall? What is too big? And that's important to us because we will be thinking about location-based and visualization and different alternative housing types to meet some of the goals that you have placed before us. So if you could just say what is too big and what is too tall in 2 minutes.
That's about what we have left. So yeah, 2 minutes.
I will say that I know a lot of people have lived in high rises, and I don't know the experience, and I think they've had positive experiences, but I do find just blocks and rows of high rises, 15 stories high and up, perhaps maybe 10 and up, to be alienating. I just plain find them alienating. And there's something about a human scale, and yeah, it just feels like it's not the way for people to live together in communities.
Thank you. Anyone else?
I can quickly answer. That tall apartment building that we see in Jamaica Plain, when we're in this section of Brookline, it is so out of scale. It's always confused me to have to learn where exactly it's located. There are areas when we drive through Brookline where there's just a looming apartment building that takes away sunlight, dominates the view, and is also completely out of character with the rest of the street. So my point that I had made numerous times was to have grass and trees and cycle tracks and to build smaller scale units that are in scale with the street. A new house is going up on Hart Street in Brookline, and I measured every single little 200-year-old cottage on Hart Street, and it is the tallest and widest building on Hart Street, and it was allowed by the Planning Board and the Zoning Board of Appeals, even with Diedrich, and it's completely out of scale. So just imagine driving along a street, walking or biking along a street, and deciding, is that an intrusion on that street and in the view shed? Thanks.
Thank you.
Anne. So Judy.
Yes.
Next steps.
So, well, actually, I had reviewed the next steps before we had our problems with the breakout session, but we're going to take all this input and save all these comments in the chat and review them. We are going to be moving into starting to think about kind of where does housing make sense and what scale and what types and so forth. The visualization and location-based strategies are kind of coming next. That will be part of the focus of the meeting that we have in February. The next big community meeting will be February 22nd. There will be a registration link. I would like all of you to come back because you've been so helpful to us this evening. But it'll be kind of a little bit different format. And again, keep your eyes open on the Housing Production Plan website for a link to a survey. We're going to be launching that just in a couple of days. It's still being translated, but it will be available soon. We'll also, of course, be sending the link out to everybody we can. So there's still a lot more engagement to go, but this has certainly been a wonderful experience for all of us. And I think, Roger, if you want to step back in now and close, that would be fine. It's your turn.
Well, thank you, Judy, first of all, for a good presentation, a lot of information, a lot of input. And I would like to thank, on behalf of the Housing Advisory Board and the working group as well, all of the members of our community who have participated tonight, who have listened in, and again, hope you found it worthwhile and that you will be motivated to engage both in the other types of outreach that our consultants will be going through over the next few months, and also in the next couple of larger community forums. So again, thanks to everybody, and we've all learned a lot, and we'll see you next time. Good
All
night.
right. Thank you so much.